What we're talking about are puppets of the American regime, and what we're talking about, the chief motivation is not to bring peace, joy, democracy. It's to make sure that the West hangs on, particularly at the moment with Putin having so much control over Russian oil. It's to hang on to oil in the Middle East.
The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, except for when they don't. Because every week, the historian Ian Wilson joins me for a regular feature, If Only We'd Known, explaining why actually the present rather closely resembles the past. And this week, we've bumped him up the running order. Ian Wilson, hello.
Hello there.
Look, today we're talking about oil and how the world's appetite for it has shaped the Middle East. When we discussed the Iranian Revolution on the show last year, we talked about ideology and religion. But if we step back, how much of that story was really about oil too?
Well, I think it probably was about oil. We've just had, I thought, a brilliant analysis by Michael Binion, and he took us back to 1953, if listeners remember that a few minutes ago, when the Prime Minister, Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, declared that they were going to nationalize something called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In 1901, when this country and Germany were having an arms race between the two great battleships and also the development of the motor car and generally internal combustion engine stuff, the world was becoming dependent not on coal as it had been for its transport and its shipping, but on oil. And the British went and bagged all the oil, basically, by setting up this thing called the Anglo-Persian. And it remained, even during the Second World War, when Iran was basically pro-German, the British more or less owned all the oil, or they claimed to. It didn't really own it morally, of course. And this was deeply resented in the area. And so in 1953, the Prime Minister, who was a popular Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, declared that he was nationalizing the oil, and it was going to be the property of the people of Iran. And that was the moment when America and Britain, obviously America by then much more powerful, intervened and put in their puppet king, Shah, as they called it.
Yeah.
And that regime lasted for about 25 years. It was very, very unpopular among large sections of the Iranian population.
So when people talk about the Shah and talk about the possibility of the Shah or his descendants coming back, I guess they think of that bit of him being a sort of like ancient Persian figure. That's not quite how you'd cast it.
I'm afraid not. What we're talking about are puppets of the American regime, and what we're talking about, the chief motivation is not to bring peace, joy, democracy. It's to make sure that the West hangs on, particularly at the moment with Putin having so much control over Russian oil. It's to hang on to oil in the Middle East.
I mean, when one looks at Iran specifically, it's the better part of half a century since they got rid of the Shah. They've been sitting on all this oil all this time. Why haven't they sorted themselves out, sitting on this huge amount of wealth?
What we're talking about is a very complex situation in which these now elderly clerics, with an ideology which to most of us seems mysterious as well as repellent, nonetheless has a hold on a very large section of the Iranian population. Not a majority by any means, and they're hated, obviously, and they're torturers and murderers, has been shown over the last few months, and indeed the last 25 years, and they've done the most terrible things. But that's all fed into the mixture, because now, again, I thought what Michael Binion was saying was so interesting about the fact that up to this point, it's been a conflict, broadly speaking, between the West and the slightly complicated, but the Sunni Muslims against these Shias. Once this bombing raid starts by Israel and by the United States, it's going to become a nationalist or national resistance. And that again is so complicated.
Well, I mean, that's more or less what happened in Iraq. But
it's more or less, as we were saying last week, what happened in Ukraine, whereas these different bits of Ukraine which had nothing particular
they all bond together.
Now they bond. Just as in this country we all hate one another. Of course we do. It's a British tradition. But if somebody tried to invade us, as they did in 1939, 1940, then we're all united against them.
I mean, one does hear what seem like reliable reports of a decent proportion of the Iranian population, sort of cheering this on. But
yes, and that was very fascinating. And the other thing which we must bear in mind is a lot of the propaganda films put out by what's left of the Iranian government of people cheering in the streets or weeping at the death of the Ayatollah, that is propaganda film. We've no idea how many people feel in that way.
Do Western governments historically become rather forgiving of unpleasant regimes when energy supplies are at stake? Can we
Yes, you can.
can we track a history there?
I
Shall we
think you
say?
can more or less do it more or less everywhere. And think of the extraordinary tolerance that Mrs. Merkel, quite a nice woman really, felt towards, I know she was an East German, but even so, towards the Russians, because they were supplying Germany with gas and oil. And that's just one example.
But, I mean,
of course we do. And I mean, think of our relationship. Look at what King Charles and the Prince of Wales and so on are asked to do on our behalf in Saudi Arabia. I mean, who would want, who among our listeners would want to do and live in Saudi Arabia?
But does this make us dreadful hypocrites? Because when we look at our relationship with, for example, I mean, Saddam Hussein is a good example, or Gaddafi in Libya, we try to cozy up to them until they basically turn off the tap. And at that point, we talk of freedom.
Well, of course we are dreadful hypocrites.
Oh, I see.
I mean, I take it that we both agree on that, Hugo, and that's the.
I try hard not to.
The starting point, but also that our main motivation is not so-called Western values or liberalism or any of these things. It's money, and it's what makes the world go round, and it's oil in this particular case. And oil is the huge source, not only of making our transport systems work, our aircrafts and all the rest of it. It's the fact that investments in oil affect our pensions and everything else.
I mean, I was fascinated by what you said about that point where the sort of global economy shifted from coal to oil. If we'd got on top of oil 100 years earlier, the history of empire would be extremely different.
It would have been totally different, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, because what made Britain leap ahead of all the other countries was that it invested in railways, and it had a huge supply of coal, which, yes, there were vast supplies of coal in Germany and in Poland and in Russia, as they eventually discovered, but it was that Britain made a use of it. And that was what they called the Industrial Revolution. And as you say, at that moment in history, if European people had discovered the possibilities of oil, then the whole history of empire would have been different.
Tell me a bit about how other nations, other powers have tried to get hold of Middle Eastern oil. Tell the Berlin to Baghdad railway.
I think myself that really the reason we had the First World War was oil.
Right.
Because there was this thing called the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, and the British became obsessed by it because it was a very successful railway which was stretching more or less into the present Middle East when the British tried to upset it in various ways. And the point of it was the British were frightened partly that the Germans would take over the routes to India and thereby cut off the sort of the jewel in the British Empire crown. But it was also because they realized that there were these oil fields in Basra, in present-day Iraq. There wasn't a country called Iraq in those days, and all the oil in Iran. And the Germans by then were intelligent enough to realize that. And it was, it's an extraordinary story. If you look at the maps, if you get a book out of your local library, you won't find many in the shops about the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. The map is an absolutely extraordinary one, and it is, of course, why the Ottoman Empire, which governed all that part of the world, was so utterly threatened and ultimately destroyed. But it's also why it allied with Germany. And if it hadn't allied with Germany, then the whole story of the First World War would have been very different too.
So look, through that prism then, what the United States is trying to do at the moment, which is basically, by extension what they're trying to do, which is transform Iran into an oil-rich nation which is friendly and helpful and not belligerent. Has that ever happened?
No, it hasn't.
Has that ever in similar conflicts?
That nobody's actually told this to the president. That
there's really not one example we can look at.
I can't think
in 20th century history. I mean, the nations like I guess Saudi Arabia in a different way.
We are actually a oil-rich nation, but I mean, if we were an oil-rich nation who was prepared to do something about it politically, we would be independent of everybody else, and that is what happened. These after, if like me, you like the film Lawrence of Arabia, after all those regions were just acres and acres, mile upon mile of sand and a few decoratively dressed heroic Arabs, suddenly they were sitting on oil, and they became very, very powerful political entities. And you're not to give that up very willingly.
Well, so if that's the story of the 20th century, and it is, we're of course out of the 20th century now, what happens next? Is this the best argument we can have for renewable energy, for wind farms, for
I
solar.
think it's the strongest possible argument. I'm not political, as you probably noticed over the weeks, but it's the strongest possible argument for being ultra green.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did become ultra green, and if the future became AI and all those sort of techie things, then the world would be a very, very different place. Because if you had cars that didn't need petrol, if you had a decision not to use airplanes so much as we've done in the past, then all these countries which are oil rich would become politically uninteresting.
Well, again, I guess the lesson from history then for us in Britain is that we need to become self-sufficient, but no more than self-sufficient, because then somebody comes along and invades us.
We don't want to, exactly, but we do. I mean, I'm not baby drill really, but I think that if we drilled a little bit more in the North Sea, which we still could, and became slightly more self-sufficient, but as you say, we do not want American troops
destabilizing,
bombing our North Sea ports,
destabilizing our own Shah or whatever. Yeah, look, Ian Wilson, always absolutely fascinating. What wonderful context. Great to have you here, as absolutely always.
Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you, Ian Wilson.
That was the budget statement. I mean, the spring statement.
That's a whole other joy.
We're all full of excitement about that.
Whole new joy still to come.